Hello, my name is Catherine Kemp, and today we will be discussing the tragedy of the commons phenomenon. Imagine there is a village with a common pasture. One family chooses to add extra cows to increase profits, and soon other families do the same. Eventually, the pasture is going to be barren and devoid of all resources. Now, this isn't just a story, this happens all over the world every day. The tragedy of the commons is a phenomenon wherein overfishing, deforestation, pollution, and climate change impact people all over the world negatively. Now, the tragedy of the commons explains how individual self-interest can lead to the depletion of shared resources, but through awareness, cooperation, and regulation, it can be prevented. The tragedy of the commons is described by Harvard Business School as an economic theory where all people have access to a common resource and consume it according to their own self-interest. A modern example of this would be congested traffic, such as the roadways being the common resource and the individual self-interest being people taking their own vehicles as opposed to public transportation. In this example, the common resource is being overburdened and is no longer efficient or actually usable because everybody is working in their own self-interest and overusing this device. A common resource can also be something like fish, air, or public parks. Although commons are not all natural resources, nature is most heavily impacted by the tragedy of the commons. Now, in terms of the origins of the tragedy of the commons, the International Association of the Study of the Commons notes that the tragedy of the commons was first introduced by ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1968. He asserted the tragedy would continue without governmental intervention or privatization. Now, Elinor Ostrom in the late 90s challenged this ideology by proving many communities can manage their own resources, as opposed to having governmental intervention. She proposed more bottom-up approaches such as grassroots startups, which prioritize communal or small group initiatives as opposed to governmental or higher power allocation of resources. Now, this model has been criticized as many view it as unrealistic or having unrealistic contingencies, seeing as it requires cooperation, diplomacy, and other things that individuals would have to give up in order to promote common good. Some issues with the commons are that nobody owns this resource and therefore there is no personal responsibility to the harms that are caused. In the original example of the village, the villagers do not take on the degradation of that common pasture until it is too far gone for their product to no longer have any sort of returns. There's also an incentive to take more than one's fair share. In basic economic terms, the rarer a product is, the more highly demanded people seek this product. Because of this, and the tragedy of the commons especially, there is a very rapid decline in the availability of certain resources. As they continually shrink, people want these resources even more. This can be obviously seen in natural gas exercises. Because of this, there is a tipping point wherein often with natural resources, there is a balance where when overused just enough, it will completely decimate that good. This can be seen with things like water quality or air quality. Often in environmental science, it is referred to as the point of no return. In terms of real-world examples, with environmental examples of the tragedy of the commons, we may observe overfishing, wherein oceans are being emptied due to a lack of regulation in international waters or enforcement of said regulations. The FAO cites that about 65% of fish stock are overfished and only sustained by restocking initiatives, aka governmental intervention. As Hardin mentioned, the tragedy of the commons may only be solved by governmental intervention or privatization. Air pollution, as well, is an example of tragedy of the commons, seeing as everybody contributes to it, but no single person bears the full cost. There is an issue with internationality because air knows no boundaries. An example of this would be the Trans-Pacific pollution, wherein China produces about 0.5 to 1.5 ozone uptake and high sulfur and carbon dioxide levels that then get transferred over onto the western United States coastline. which results in increased wildfires and health concerns with this general region. Now, this is problematic because China does not incur the specific health costs of the pollution they are incurring on the common resource, which is air. Deforestation, lastly, is highly used as an example of the tragedy of the commons because companies often cut forests for profit, but the long-term consequences affect every person in terms of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide uptake. The Amazon rainforest is a prime example of this, as it is spread across several countries in Latin America, and they are often overpillaged for their resources. However, the Amazon rainforest provides a very important carbon sink globally. Now, in terms of solutions and preventions, legislation has been proved to help the tragedy of the commons results. The Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act are two prime examples in the United States that have been used to effectively clean air and water resources within this region. There are also local fisheries restocking programs, as Elinor Ostrom suggested. Communities taking on the burdens of these goods has proved to be beneficial. And then consumerism, lastly, is highly important because supporting corporations that are sustainable or responsible with their consumption is highly important. To conclude, the tragedy of the commons may or may not be inevitable. However, there are several global examples of how it has taken effect. There are also many countries and many different ways in which it can be diminished across the world. Thank you.